Good morning. Today's reading is from Revelation 12, 1 through 17. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river, to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. God bless the reading of his word.
Thank you, John, for reading our scripture today. Now, how many of you have a manger scene on display at your house? Most of us do. This passage that John read to us helps us understand the startling drama that was taking place behind that manger scene. In Revelation 12, we see a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, a crown of 12 stars on her head. And this resplendent woman was pregnant and cried out as she was about to give birth. But then something startling shows up. An enormous red dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment he was born. And you might think, this is Christmas? Yeah. This is Christmas. Christmas is the adoring shepherds and the magi and the baby in the manger and an enormous red dragon meant to do this baby harm. Now, last week we saw this same serpent-like creature. We were in the first book of the Bible last week, the book of Genesis, and we see a serpent-like creature tempt Eve and Adam into sin, and because of their rebellion against God, the world that God so perfectly created was ruined. And we saw last week that God prophesied to this serpent-like creature, "Because you have done this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, you will strike his heel." And now this week we go all the way from the first book of the Bible to the last book of the Bible, and yet we see this same creature again, this serpent, this dragon. And just as the serpent in Genesis 3 will strike and injure Eve's offspring, the serpent in Revelation chapter 12 aims to strike and injure the child born to this resplendent woman. Now, when you read a passage like this for the first time, especially at Christmas time, it's understandable that you would assume that this resplendent woman that the Apostle John sees is the Virgin Mary. But it's not. It is faithful Israel. Faithful Israel is seen as this woman with 12 stars in her crown, just as Israel had 12 tribes in its confederation. So what John is showing us here is all of the Old Testament. All of the Old Testament is faithful Israel travailing in childbirth for centuries until the Messiah finally comes forth. And in John's vision, this child is born and then he is caught up to God and escapes the jaws of the dragon. And so in one verse, we have Christmas and Easter. In one verse, we have the birth of the Messiah and the resurrection of the Messiah. Because you see in verse 5, when we see that the child is caught up to God in heaven from the dragon's jaws, this is a picture, this is a symbol of Jesus dying on the cross. He's in the dragon's jaws, but then he is snatched away from what the dragon thought was his victory. And in resurrection, he is taken up in glory into heaven. So in verse 5, all 33 years of Jesus' earthly life are contracted down to his birth and his resurrection, of being caught up to God in resurrection glory. So Christmas and Easter, the birth of the Messiah and the resurrection of the Messiah. And in fact, what's so breathtaking about these verses is, in just 6 verses, we see not just the 33 years of Jesus' earthly life, we see all of biblical history from beginning to end, just in these 6 verses. Verses 1 through 4, verse 5, verse 6. Verses 1 through 4 is all of the Old Testament. Like a woman travailing in childbirth for centuries until the Messiah finally comes forth. And then verse 5 is the 33 years of Jesus' earthly life, Christmas and Easter, all rolled into one verse. And then verse 6 is all of church history from the Acts of the Apostles until the end of time. Now this is the story that you've fallen into. The passage says here that when the dragon saw that what he thought was victory was actually loss, Christ was resurrected and ascended into heaven. When he saw that, he turned around and made war on the woman and the rest of her offspring. Who's the rest of her offspring? You and me. We are the rest of the offspring of faithful Israel. Faithful Israel travailed in childbirth until the Messiah came forth. And now you and I are products of faithful Israel ourselves. Jesus, or the Apostle Paul said in Romans 9, 10, and 11, he used a different image there. He said that you and I are wild olive branches grafted into the olive tree being faithful Israel. So Christianity is completed Judaism. Christianity is faithful Israel. And you and I have been invited into that. We are the offspring of faithful Israel. So this grand story that we see in Revelation chapter 12 is how your stories make sense. All the little joys and sorrows of your life, all the little trials and tribulations, all the little victories, all the little advances, all the little setbacks, they only make sense as you situate your stories in God's grand story. You know, one of the best moments in Tolkien's epic, The Lord of the Rings, is when Sam is reminiscing with Frodo about heroic tales and songs of his childhood. And he stops as he thinks through the stories of the past and he says, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into, Mr. Frodo. Well, this is the tale that you have fallen into. Your life, your story is part of an epic tale, a story of adventure and heartache and betrayal and heroism and honor. An entire culture goes off track when we forget that story. And your life goes off track when you forget that story. Today's passage is meant to remind us once again that all our little decisions, all the events of our lives only make sense when we situate our life in God's big story. Now, if this is the story that we've fallen into, what kind of tale have we fallen into? According to the rest of Revelation chapter 12, we see that this life that we've fallen into is a wilderness life, a supplied life, a prevailing life, and a trusting life. So let's look at each one of these. You can look at your sermon notes in your bulletin. You can find a pen or a pencil. Let's write these things down. First of all, life in this tale you've fallen into is a wilderness life. A wilderness life. Verse 6 says the woman fled into the wilderness. Verse 14 elaborates on that by adding, the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. Now this should remind us of the Old Testament days of the Exodus. In fact, even that imagery of being given the wings of an eagle to fly into the wilderness comes from the Exodus days. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, God reminded his people, you yourselves have seen how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So the story of the Exodus, how did it begin? It began with the Passover lamb being slain so that God's people might be set free from Egyptian slavery. And then they headed into the wilderness on the way to a promised land. Isn't that your story? Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. That's what the Apostle Paul wrote in one of his letters. And because of that sacrifice, we have been set free from our slavery to sin. And now we are in a wilderness life on our way to the promised land, heaven. Your life, therefore, just like the people of the Exodus times, is a wilderness life. Now, in the Bible, the wilderness was always a place of alienation from this world. Don't you sometimes feel alienated from this world? The priorities of this world, the things that the world considers important and unimportant, doesn't it make you feel like a stranger even in your own homeland sometimes? It is a wilderness life. Wilderness life in the Bible times was a difficult time. Isn't your life sometimes difficult? The wilderness life in the Bible was a time of limited supplies where you had to cast yourself on God to take care of you. Don't we sometimes experience that where we have needs that only God can supply to us? Ours is a wilderness life as well. What a perfect picture of the believer's life, a wilderness life. We are collectively the woman in this vision. We are in the wilderness on our way to the promised land. But thank God, there's a second thing we can say about this kind of life. And you can write this down. This life, this tale you've fallen into, is a supplied life. It's a wilderness life, but it's also a supplied life. Verse 6 says that in the wilderness, the woman was taken care of for 1,260 days. And then we have that phrase again, she was taken care of. We find it again in verse 14, where it says she was taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. Now, that's weird language, but this lets us know that we are in the world of apocalypse. The book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. Just as poetry is to be interpreted differently than prose, just as history is to be interpreted differently than a fictional story, in the same way, there are rules for understanding and interpreting apocalyptic literature. And for John to refer to times, time, and half a time, or 1,260 days, takes us into the apocalyptic world of Daniel. Daniel in the Old Testament used this very language to refer to a 3.5-year period at the end of human history where Satan will unleash his worst against God's people. And so 1,260 days, times, time, and a half a time, all of that is the same way, or multiple ways of saying the same thing. So time, times, and half a time, that's a year, plus 2 years, plus a half a year, that's 3.5 years. So 1,260 days, that's 42 months, or 3.5 years. It's all the way of saying, or it's all different ways of saying the exact same thing. And like I said, that lets us know that we're speaking, or John is speaking specifically about the close of human history, where Satan will hurl his worst at God's people. Now, the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation for a people facing hard times. And he was trying to say to these people who are so dear to him, if you're facing hard times for the sake of Christ, you're in good company. because at the end of days, God's people will face bitter, hard, difficult times for belonging to Jesus. You see, that's one reason we study prophecy. We study prophecy, like the book of Revelation, so we can learn how to live today. You study biblical history to learn how God's people in the past were faithful. You study biblical prophecy so you can learn how God's people in the future will be faithful. And that's how you learn to be faithful today in the present. You know, on our bookshelves, the only reason our books stay up is because they are between bookmarks, heavy bookmarks. And those bookmarks keep the books from tumbling over. Those books stay up because of the bookmarks. Your life is kept from tumbling over because your life is propped up between the bookmarks of God's people in the past and God's people yet to come. And we look at biblical history to look at one side of that bookmark, to see how God's people in the past remained faithful. And another bookmark is God's people in the future. We look at biblical prophecy to see what God's people in the future are going to do when times get tough. And in that way, between those bookmarks, you and I, as God's people in the present, learn how to live faithful lives. That's the reason we study prophecy. So don't miss the point here. Twice, this woman in the wilderness is said to be taken care of. That's the phrase. She is taken care of in the wilderness. Well, God does that for us today too. He takes care of us physically, of course, but even more importantly than that, He takes care of us spiritually. This evening, as we have done for 20 years as a church, we'll get together at 6 p.m. and we'll have sing some carols, and we'll sing by candlelight at the end, and we'll enjoy communion, the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is a symbol of how God takes care of us. Just as our body is nourished by food, God nourishes us spiritually and takes care of our soul by His presence, by His mercy, by His wisdom, by His strength, by His commands. He is feeding us. He is nourishing us. He is, to use the phrase here, taking care of us in the wilderness. You need this kind of nourishment on a night when you are lying in bed, looking up at the ceiling, your eyes wide awake, wondering what to do now. You need this kind of nourishment when you're by the bedside of a loved one, watching them take their final breaths, wondering how your life is ever going to be the same with them out of your life. You need this kind of nourishment if you've, to the depths of your soul, come to realize how frail and fragile you are up against the power of temptation. Thank God then that in our wilderness life, we enjoy a supplied life. God takes care of us, as John says in this pictorial imagery here in Revelation chapter 12. Here's a third thing to write down. Life in this tale you've fallen into is a prevailing life. A prevailing life. The fact that it is a supplied life assures us that it can be a prevailing life. Look at verses 10 and 11. This is what John hears immediately after he sees the archangel Michael cast the devil away after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, for the authority and the authority of His Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down." What a great image. The accuser has been hurled down. I've noticed this. I've been a pastor for a little over 40 years now, and I've noticed that in the first 20 or so years of my pastoral ministry, the main thing that helped people evangelistically was that the gospel could help you overcome fear. Could help you overcome the fear of death. But more and more in these last 20 years of my ministry, I've noticed more and more books about not so much the fear of death, but the fear of shame, the need to overcome shame. Well, isn't this a perfect picture here of how we can overcome shame? Our accuser, the one who was always before the throne of God, accusing us, telling God what lousy people we were because of our flaws and failures, has been cast out of heaven and cast out of the presence of God because of what? The death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we are set free not just from the fear of death, that's a great truth, but we are set free from the fear of shame. Now don't miss this in verse 11. We triumph over this accuser in this way, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. So, as I said before, we learn how to be the people of God in the present by looking at the people of God in the past in biblical history, by looking at the people of God in the future through biblical prophecy. And we see here that the people of God in the future will triumph over the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and by their testimony. That is the same way we triumph as the people of God today, by the blood of the Lamb and by our testimony. You notice there's one thing that Jesus does and one thing we must do. Jesus died for us. He died on the cross to take away our sin, to set us free from shame. But now we have to receive that. We have to accept that by our testimony. We have to publicly commit to what Jesus has done for us so that people know that we are believers in Jesus Christ. So it's the blood of the Lamb, and by our response to that, our reception of that publicly, our testimony. That's how we prevail over the evil one. So this is a prevailing life that we're in. It is a wilderness life. It is a supplied life. It's a prevailing life. And here's the fourth thing, that is a trusting life. This tale you've fallen into is a trusting life. We have to trust that verse 12 is true. It says the dragon is filled with fury. Here's what we have to trust. His time is short. In one of her books, Ann Voskamp tells about a missionary's story she once heard. The missionary told of an enormous anaconda that slithered right through the front door of his home. His wife ran outside screaming, and a machete-wielding neighbor came in and calmly walked into her kitchen, and he sliced off the head of this serpent. But a headless snake will continue to writhe, and so for hours this missionary couple stood helplessly outside while the body of this snake smashed furniture and windows and all things beautiful inside their house. Voskamp says that evil is like that. She wrote, a snake may wreak havoc, but it has no head. It's really dead. Even if the tail still rampages, the snake's head is crushed. We have to believe that that is true. Our pain and our heartbreak in this broken world is real. The snake is still slithering, but his days are limited because the Messiah has been born, the one who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. He has been born, and the devil's chaos is coming to an end. So life inside this tale you've fallen into is a wilderness life. It's a supplied life. It is a prevailing life, and it is a trusting life. In one of the best songs that Paul Simon ever composed, he sings, I'm going to tell my kids a bedtime story, a play without a plot. Will it have a happy ending? Maybe yeah, maybe not. I tell them life is what you make of it. So beautiful, or so what? Those are the only choices you have in life, is to look upon life as beautiful or to shrug your shoulders at the chaos of it and say, so what? It doesn't make any sense. There's no order to this. I'm just a pinball bouncing around in a pinball machine until I drop into a grave 6 feet under. But we look into the Bible and we see that the life that we're in is not a play without a plot. There's an order to it. No matter how chaotic it gets, no matter how heartbreaking it gets, a great and good author is composing this. And the story of Christmas is how that author wrote himself into the story, becoming the central character of the story in Jesus, so that he might live our kind of life and die our kind of death to take away our sin and make us fit for heaven. As Charles Wesley put it in the profoundest of all the Christmas carols, late in life, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. Remember what we learned last week? that it would be Eve's offspring who would come to crush the head of the serpent. And Charles Wesley kind of harkens back to that by saying, late in time, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb, veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Let this story help you make sense out of all the little stories of your life. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Jesus, you are Emmanuel. You are God with us. Help us feel that truth. Help us to really know that truth today. In big ways and small ways, show us how you are walking with us through the stories of our lives. If we are your people in the present, and we can look back over how your people were faithful in the past, and through prophecy we can look forward to how your people will remain faithful in the future. That props us up. Those bookends prop us up so we don't tumble over. Help us then to see this story helps us make sense of all the little stories of our lives. Help us to trust you, Jesus. Help us to situate our story, find ourselves in this story in Revelation 12 that we've looked at today. And help us rejoice that Jesus, you were God writing himself into this grand story so that we might have a Savior. We trust you today, Jesus. In your name we pray these things. Amen.